In a bustling restaurant, a waitress with hidden talent faces an arrogant patron who challenges her in front of a crowd. What happens next changes everything, not just for her, but for everyone watching. A quiet waitress, a grand piano, and a room filled with privileged diners. When Leonard Grayson, a smug and powerful patron, mockingly dares Deborah to prove her worth, the night takes an unexpected turn. As her trembling fingers meet the keys, the music begins to flow, weaving a tale of struggle, resilience, and triumph. By the end of her performance, the once dismissive crowd erupts into applause, leaving Leonard stunned and silenced. But that's just the beginning of Deborah's journey. This is a story of courage, artistry, and the power of standing tall in the face of belittlement. Don't miss a second of this extraordinary moment. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The grand piano gleamed under the soft lights of La Fontaine, a haven of luxury nestled in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a warm Friday evening, and the restaurant was alive with the quiet hum of refined conversation, punctuated by the gentle clinking of glasses and the soft, lilting strains of jazz. The ambience, an intoxicating mix of sophistication and indulgence, wrapped around the diners like a tailored coat. Among them, unnoticed yet indispensable, was Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress whose poised demeanor concealed dreams far greater than the opulent dining room she moved through. With practiced grace, Deborah navigated the tables, her tray balanced as delicately as her composure. To the patrons, she was just another face, a cog in the intricate machinery of their evening. But within her burned a quiet fire, one ignited in a small South Carolina town where music was her lifeline. The piano had been her sanctuary since childhood, the worn keys of a neighbor's out-of-tune gift becoming the stage for her first melodies. While other kids played outdoors, she would lose herself in the soaring crescendos of classical compositions or the comforting rhythms of gospel hymns. Her talent blossomed early, catching the attention of her community. Church recitals, school performances, and local events became her outlets. Yet dreams, as bright as they were, did not shield her from reality. Scholarships slipped through her fingers, and family responsibilities anchored her aspirations. By 18, she knew the stage she longed for would have to wait. Music was her soul, but survival was her priority. When Deborah moved to Raleigh, La Fontaine wasn't just a job. It was a compromise. The grand piano in the corner wasn't merely decor. It was a reminder that her dreams still lingered, waiting for their moment. Though her shifts left little time to play, she found solace knowing it was there, a silent witness to her resilience. That evening, as the dinner rush began to settle, the restaurant doors swung open with an air of drama. Leonard Grayson entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. The wealthy entrepreneur, known for his sharp wit and sharper tongue, moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to owning every room he stepped into. Flanked by his entourage, Leonard exuded an almost theatrical arrogance. The staff exchanged wary glances. Leonard wasn't an ordinary guest. He thrived on spectacle, often at the expense of others. For Deborah, however, he was just another table in a long night's work. She approached with her usual poise, her tray steady despite the weight of his gaze. But Leonard wasn't just observing her. He was planning. "Deborah," he said, eyeing her name tag as she set down his drink. "That's a name with promise. Tell me, Deborah, what do you do when you're not balancing plates?" Her hands faltered for the briefest of moments. His words weren't casual. They were a trap, baited with curiosity, but sharpened with condescension. Deborah met his gaze, her voice calm yet measured. "I play piano sometimes," she replied, hoping to deflect his attention. But Leonard was relentless. "Piano, you say? How intriguing. You must show us." His words carried an edge that made her stomach tighten. The suggestion wasn't a request. It was a challenge, his tone laced with mockery. The room, once filled with the comfortable hum of diners, seemed to hold its breath. Deborah hesitated. Playing the piano here, under these circumstances, felt like exposing a piece of her soul to a man who would only tear it apart. But before she could respond, Leonard rose from his seat, his voice booming with performative enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the presence of a hidden talent tonight. Let's not deprive ourselves of this moment." The room turned toward her, the spotlight now uncomfortably bright. Deborah's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had faced challenges before. This was no different. Without a word, she moved toward the piano, her steps steady despite the storm raging inside her. As she sat down, her fingers hovered over the keys, their familiar coolness grounding her. Closing her eyes, she let the noise fade away, focusing instead on the music buried deep within her heart. The first notes emerged, hesitant but pure, weaving a melody that seemed to draw the air from the room. Deborah played as if her soul were speaking, the music a language of emotion that needed no translation. The jazzy undercurrent shifted into a classical piece, its complexity a testament to her skill. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and even Leonard's smirk faltered. The melody rose and fell, carrying with it a story of resilience, beauty, and unyielding hope. By the time the final note lingered in the air, the restaurant was silent, the usual clinking of glasses and murmurs replaced by stunned awe. Deborah rose, her hands trembling but her head held high. She met Leonard's gaze, his expression a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration. Without waiting for his response, Deborah returned to her duties, the moment of quiet victory she didn't need to announce. The room buzzed with whispers, her performance leaving an indelible mark. Leonard, for all his arrogance, was left speechless, his attempt to belittle her turned into an unintentional spotlight for her brilliance. And though the night continued as usual, something had shifted. Deborah wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a force, her talent undeniable, her dreams no longer hidden in the shadows. The room seemed to hold its breath as Deborah's gaze met Leonard's. The man who had orchestrated her public test now sat still, his usual air of arrogance replaced by something she couldn't quite define. His smirk was gone, his confidence visibly shaken. For a fleeting moment, Deborah wondered if he would say something sharp to regain control of the situation. But no words came. Leonard simply stared back, his slow, almost reluctant clap having ended long ago. Deborah felt a surge of strength rise within her, a quiet yet unyielding power she hadn't realized she possessed until now. This moment wasn't about Leonard or the game he'd tried to play. It wasn't about proving something to the crowd or even herself. It was about the music, her music, and the truth it carried. She had bared her soul through the piano, and in doing so, she had turned a spectacle meant to humiliate her into a triumph of grace and resilience. As Deborah stepped away from the piano, the applause rekindled, softer now but no less heartfelt. The diners offered warm smiles and nods of approval. One elderly woman near the front caught Deborah's eye and mouthed, "Beautiful." Deborah smiled back, her heart swelling with gratitude. She turned to return to her duties, but the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man with a perpetually furrowed brow, intercepted her. "Deborah," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "That was extraordinary. Take a moment if you need it. You've earned it." His words, so unexpected, brought a lump to her throat. She nodded, whispering a soft, "Thank you," before retreating toward the kitchen. In the quiet refuge of the staff area, Deborah leaned against the wall, her hands trembling as the adrenaline ebbed away. Her heart still raced, but a smile played on her lips. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices that had brought her here, and of the countless nights she had doubted herself. Tonight, for the first time in years, she felt like that girl who had once believed anything was possible. Back in the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted. Leonard's entourage had grown unusually quiet. their laughter replaced by uneasy glances at their host. Leonard himself seemed lost in thought, his fingers tapping idly against his glass. One of his companions leaned in and murmured something, but Leonard waved him off, his gaze fixed on the piano as if it held some answer he couldn't grasp. Deborah returned to the floor a few minutes later, her professional composure restored. She approached Leonard's table to clear the dessert plates, her movements precise and calm. Leonard looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met again. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp bill, and placed it on the table. For the performance, he said, his voice quieter than it had been all evening. Deborah hesitated before replying, her tone polite but firm. "Thank you, sir, but I don't play for tips." She turned and walked away, leaving Leonard and his companions in stunned silence. As the night wound down and the last of the diners left, Deborah lingered near the piano, her fingers brushing the keys one final time. The restaurant had emptied, the energy of the evening dissipating into the stillness of the late hour. But something new lingered in the air, a sense of possibility, fragile yet undeniable. That night, as she walked home beneath the stars, Deborah's mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. The Music Academy application she had tucked away in a drawer suddenly seemed less like a distant dream and more like an imminent reality. Her performance tonight had reminded her of who she was and what she was capable of. She reached her small apartment and sat at her second-hand piano, the familiar feel of the keys grounding her. Closing her eyes, she began to play again, not for an audience but for herself. The melody flowed freely, carrying with it the hope of a new beginning and the promise that her music could and would take her further than she had ever imagined. Leonard remained seated, his hands clasped on the table in an attempt to mask his unease. The brazen confidence he had worn so effortlessly earlier had vanished, replaced by an expression of forced neutrality. It was as though he couldn't decide whether to concede his misstep or double down on his arrogance. After a beat of heavy silence, he finally spoke, his voice louder than it needed to be, as if to reassert control over the moment. "Well," he said with a strained chuckle that was unexpected. The attempt at humor landed flat. His chuckle lacked the bravado it once held, and his comment, though seemingly complimentary, carried a tinge of condescension. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places," he added, leaning back slightly as though retreating from the weight of his own words. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh politely or remain silent. The tension at the table was palpable, a stark contrast to the jovial arrogance that had filled the room earlier. Deborah tilted her head, studying Leonard with a calm yet piercing gaze. His words, though meant to be an olive branch, felt hollow. They weren't an acknowledgement of her talent, but rather a thinly veiled attempt to save face. "Thank you," Deborah said simply, her tone measured and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but neither was there hostility. She wouldn't allow Leonard to pull her back into the smallness he had tried to impose upon her. Her performance had already spoken louder than any retort she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable under the collective gaze of the diners. He gestured to a waiter for another drink, a flimsy attempt to regain composure. "You've got quite a gift," he said, his tone begrudging, as if the words tasted bitter on his tongue. Deborah's response came swiftly, her gaze unwavering. "Everyone has a gift," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." Her words hung in the air, each syllable carrying deliberate weight. It wasn't loud, nor was it aggressive, but it was enough to cut through Leonard's pretense. The room seemed to hold its breath, the subtle sting of her response rippling through the air. Leonard shifted in his seat, his confidence unraveling further with each passing second. Gradually, the other diners turned their attention back to their meals, though the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Where there had once been the quiet hum of privilege and pretense, there was now something richer, a shared understanding, perhaps even admiration, for the waitress who had reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. But Leonard was not merely humiliated. He was exposed. The layers of charm and arrogance he had so carefully constructed had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable. Everyone in the room now saw him for what he was, a man caught in his own hubris. Deborah stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. As she returned to her station, her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement. Though she still had a job to finish, something about her presence had shifted. Her head was held higher, her steps more deliberate, and her movements carried a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Leonard's table had grown noticeably quieter. The entourage that had laughed so freely at her expense now avoided her gaze, their conversation subdued. The bravado that once filled their corner of the restaurant had evaporated, leaving only an awkward silence in its wake. As Deborah made her rounds, patrons stopped her to offer kind words. "You're incredible," an older woman said softly as Deborah placed a cup of coffee on her table. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going," another man added, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just empty compliments. They were validations of her talent and the years of effort she had poured into her music. They were affirmations of her dreams, long deferred but never abandoned. Leonard, however, was not so gracious. As Deborah approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her, his expression teetering between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone clipped and defensive. "No need to rub it in." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I just wanted to play." Her words were simple, yet they carried a quiet power that left Leonard without a response. He fidgeted with his drink, the once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it. As Leonard scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked at Deborah and offered a tentative smile. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "your performance was incredible." "Truly." Deborah nodded in acknowledgement, offering a faint but genuine smile in return. She turned and walked away, her steps steady and purposeful. The applause, the compliments, the shifting dynamics, all of it had validated something within her, something far deeper than recognition or approval. That night, as Deborah walked home beneath a sky full of stars, her thoughts turned to the future. The grand piano she had played was no longer a distant symbol of what she yearned for, but a reminder of what she was capable of. She had faced a challenge, reclaimed her voice, and proven, to herself most of all, that her dreams were worth fighting for. Deborah stared at the young man, his earnest words lingering in the air. "You were amazing, truly," he had said, his sincerity catching her off guard. For a fleeting moment, she glimpsed a spark of humanity in a group she had dismissed as shallow and self-absorbed. She met his eyes, offering a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she replied softly, before turning and walking away. The restaurant was quiet now, the hum of conversation replaced by the occasional clink of glasses being cleared. Leonard and his entourage exited, without their usual fanfare. There were no grand gestures, no hearty laughs echoing through the night. Their departure was subdued, almost hurried, as though the weight of the evening had crushed their bravado. Deborah watched them leave, her emotion steady. She felt neither triumph nor bitterness. Leonard, for all his arrogance, was no longer the focal point of her thoughts. Her attention had shifted entirely to the next chapter. That night's tips were unusually generous, the result of patrons moved by her performance and her poise. As Deborah tallied up the earnings, her chest swelled with a quiet pride. The money wasn't just enough to cover her rent. It also left room to afford the piano lessons she had postponed time and again. As she locked up the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp night air, Deborah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: certainty. The cold bit at her cheeks, but her steps were light, purposeful. She wasn't just a waitress, nor was she merely a dreamer chasing an elusive goal. She was an artist, and for the first time in a long while, she embraced that identity fully. The modest apartment she returned to held no illusions of grandeur. Her old upright piano sat in the corner, its once polished surface now dulled by years of use. Deborah settled onto the worn bench, her fingers grazing the faded keys. She began to play, the familiar notes filling the small space. The sound lacked the richness of the grand piano at La Fontaine, but the music came from her heart, as it always had. That night's events were not just a moment of victory. They were a turning point. Deborah realized that her talent, her passion, was not something to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. She no longer needed validation from anyone, not Leonard, not the patrons, not even herself. Her music was her truth, and it had spoken louder than any words ever could. In the days that followed, whispers of her performance spread through the local community. Patrons who had been at the restaurant that night shared the story, embellishing it with their own admiration and awe. Deborah became a quiet sensation, her name circulating among those who appreciated her authenticity and skill. Then, one afternoon, she received a call that felt like destiny. A man introduced himself as a music producer visiting from Nashville. He had been in the restaurant that night and had been deeply moved by her performance. "I'm not offering fame or fortune," he said, his tone measured and honest, "but I'd like to help you record a demo. I think your music deserves to be heard." Deborah's heart raced as she listened. This wasn't a promise of overnight success, but it was a chance, a door opening where none had existed before. She agreed without hesitation, not out of desperation, but out of conviction. For years, she had allowed fear and self-doubt to hold her back, whispering that her dreams were too big, too impossible. Now, she saw those whispers for what they were: lies. The incident with Leonard wasn't just a clash of personalities or a dramatic spectacle. It was a profound reminder of resilience and the power of integrity. Leonard, with all his wealth and bravado, had represented every doubt and insecurity Deborah had ever faced. But she had silenced those doubts with nothing more than the purity of her craft. To anyone observing Deborah's story, the message was unmistakable. Never let others define your worth. The world is full of people like Leonard Grayson, individuals who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true power lies in authenticity, in staying rooted in who you are and letting your passion speak louder than any ridicule or condescension. That night, as Deborah closed the lid of her piano and rested her hands on its worn surface, she smiled to herself. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like it had truly begun. The fear that had once held her captive was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. And as she drifted to sleep, her dreams were no longer distant and unattainable. They were vivid, alive, and closer than ever. If Deborah's story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of resilience and triumph. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life.